If you believe in destiny and stories of enduring love, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. New and original tales of romance are shared here every day, each more heartwarming than the last. Late autumn had settled over the city with a quiet, cinematic melancholy, the sky pale and the streets brushed with wind that carried fallen leaves like whispers. Inside a modest apartment filled with shared routines, 2 coffee mugs, a blanket folded on the couch, a pair of keys always left on the same hook, love was slowly being misunderstood. Not because it was absent, but because it wasn't being spoken in the way she needed to hear it. They had been together long enough for infatuation to soften into something steadier, but not long enough to feel unbreakable. She loved him truly, deeply, and she had imagined romance as a language couples learn naturally, a surprise note in a pocket, flowers on a difficult day, a message just to say, "I'm thinking of you." She didn't need extravagance, she needed reassurance, proof that she mattered in the kind of way that could be felt without guessing. He, however, loved differently. His devotion lived in quiet habits, making sure her car had gas, fixing what broke before she noticed, keeping their bills organized, bringing her tea when her throat sounded tired. He listened, he stayed, he showed up. Yet he rarely offered the kind of romance that would translate clearly in her heart. His affection was practical, grounded, almost protective, but to her it began to look like distance. The observer of destiny watched the gap form slowly, the way cracks do in winter pavement. She tried to bridge it at first with gentle hints, smiling as she mentioned how other couples celebrated small moments. She sent him posts, little jokes, subtle invitations. He would nod, maybe laugh, maybe kiss her forehead and say, "That's cute." But he rarely acted, not because he didn't care, because he was afraid. Behind his calm, something heavy had been quietly taking over his life. He'd been living with a truth he could barely look at in the mirror. He moved through his days carrying a secret that had turned time into something fragile, and in that private fear, romance began to feel risky. How do you plan a future when you are terrified you might not have one? How do you promise forever when you're uncertain of tomorrow? So he held back. Not from love, but from the possibility of breaking her heart. She didn't know any of that. All she felt was the loneliness of being close to someone who seemed emotionally far. There were evenings when she would dress a little nicer, hoping he'd notice. He did notice, but his eyes would flicker away too quickly, as if he had no right to enjoy what he might lose. There were weekends when she planned little outings, hoping he'd meet her effort with excitement. Instead, he often seemed tired, distracted, or distant. He would still go, he would still pay, he would still drive them home safely. But something in him looked elsewhere, trapped inside thoughts he refused to share. Eventually, hurt turned into certainty. Certainty is dangerous when it is built on missing information. She began telling herself a story that made the pain easier to manage. He doesn't really love me. If he did, he'd try. If he wanted me, he would show it. The observer of destiny recognized that she was not wrong to want romance. She was only wrong about the reason it was missing. The argument that ended it happened on a night when the apartment felt colder than usual. Rain hit the window in thin lines, streetlights glowing like blurred stars. She stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, voice trembling, not with anger, but with exhaustion. She told him she didn't want to beg for affection anymore. She told him she felt like she was fading in his life. He tried to answer, tried to reach for words, but fear tightened his throat. His silence became her proof. She said the words that both of them would remember forever. I don't think you love me the way I love you." His eyes darkened with pain. He wanted to scream the truth, that she was everything, that he was terrified, that his love was bigger than his ability to show it. But the secret pressed down like a hand over his mouth, shame mixed with fear, and instead of confessing, he simply whispered, "I'm sorry." That apology shattered her. It sounded like agreement, so she left. Not dramatically, not cruelly. She packed a bag with shaking hands, tears slipping down her cheeks, and walked out of the apartment believing she was choosing dignity. He stood frozen, watching the door close, unable to run after her, not because he didn't want to, but because he believed he didn't deserve to drag her into the nightmare he was hiding. And when she was gone, the apartment fell silent in the most unforgiving way. Love was still there, but now it had nowhere to go. Winter arrived abruptly, as if the city itself had decided not to soften the consequences of what had happened. The air sharpened, the mornings turned grey, and everything that once felt familiar now carried an uncomfortable quiet. She tried to move forward with the logic she had used to protect herself, that leaving was necessary, that love shouldn't feel like guessing, that she deserved to be chosen out loud. Friends supported her. They reminded her that affection should be visible, that romance, at least in its simplest forms, was not too much to ask for. She nodded, repeated those words to herself, and still felt a hollow ache whenever she passed the building they had called home. He didn't reach out, not because he didn't miss her. He missed her with a physical intensity that made breathing feel difficult, but because shame had become a cage. He replayed the breakup again and again, hearing her voice, seeing her tears, feeling the moment he failed to speak. Each time he imagined telling her the truth, the same fear returned, that she would stay out of guilt, or pity, or obligation, and he could not bear the thought of becoming that kind of burden in her life. The observer of destiny watched him do what many frightened hearts do, confuse protection with abandonment. He kept his days structured, appointments, paperwork, routine. He moved through the world with the composure of someone who refuses to fall apart in public. But at night, the apartment was too quiet. Every corner held evidence of her favorite mug, a scarf on a hook, a faint scent on the couch cushion that still felt like her presence. And behind the ordinary remnants of shared life sat the secret that had already been shaping his choices for months, the diagnosis he had hidden in a drawer, sealed away as if distance from it could lessen its truth. She didn't return to the apartment right away. At first, she avoided it completely, asking a friend to help with practical details, telling herself she didn't need anything left behind. But time has a way of forcing closure. A bill still in her name, mail that continued to arrive, a few personal items she couldn't replace. Eventually, she decided to go back one afternoon when she believed he would be out. She told herself it was just logistics, nothing emotional. She was wrong. The building's hallway smelled the same, but everything felt different, like stepping into a photograph of a life that no longer belonged to her. Inside the apartment, silence greeted her like a witness. She moved carefully, avoiding the places where memory struck hardest. She gathered a few belongings from the bedroom, folded them quickly, kept her eyes down. She tried not to think of the nights they had spent there, laughing softly, planning small futures. She tried not to imagine him sitting alone in the same space. The observer of destiny lingered close, because this was where the story's true turning point waited, hidden not in grand gestures, but in a simple drawer. She opened it looking for a document, something she remembered leaving behind. The drawer caught slightly, then slid forward. Inside were scattered papers, a folder, a few receipts. And then she saw it, a medical report unmistakable in its formatting, with his full name printed at the top. Her stomach dropped. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, eyes scanning words she did not want to understand. Diagnosis, treatment plan, oncology. Dates that stretched back months, months when she had been pleading for romance, while he had been quietly fighting panic behind his silence. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was as if all the arguments, all the hurt, all the certainty she had built to survive the breakup collapsed in one instant. The missing romance hadn't been indifference. It hadn't been lack of love. It had been fear, raw and consuming, and the kind of shame that convinces someone they are not allowed to need help. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the paper shaking in her hands, tears blurring the lines until they became unreadable. Anger rose next, sharp and protective. Not the anger of being unloved, but the anger of being excluded from the truth. She had left believing she was unwanted, when the real story was that he had been terrified. She thought of every time he had looked distracted, every time he had seemed far away, every time he had whispered, "I'm sorry," with a heaviness she couldn't decode. The observer of destiny noted the cruel irony. She had wanted him to prove love with romance, while he had been hiding a storm he believed would destroy them both. She didn't leave the apartment immediately. She searched for more, not out of suspicion, but out of desperation to understand. More papers confirmed it, appointments, prescriptions, notes in his handwriting. The timeline was undeniable. He had been living with this alone, letting her believe the worst, because he couldn't face the possibility of her staying out of obligation. A quiet sob escaped her, the kind that comes from realizing how much pain can exist in the space between two people who love each other. By the time she stepped back into the cold air outside, her hands were still trembling. She didn't feel confused anymore. She felt determined. She was done with guessing, done with half-truths, done with silence. If he had hidden this out of love, then love would now demand courage in return. She drove through the city with the diagnosis folded in her bag like a heavy secret reclaimed, knowing exactly where she was going. The observer of destiny watched as she approached the next threshold, not the door of an apartment, but the door of truth itself, because the obstacle was no longer cancer alone. It was the shame that had made him believe he had to suffer in silence, and she was about to confront it. The first time she knocked on his door after the breakup, her hand shook so hard she had to steady it against the frame. The hallway was warm, but her skin felt cold, as if winter had followed her inside. She had rehearsed 100 opening sentences on the drive over: anger, tenderness, accusation, comfort. But the truth was heavier than any script. In her bag, the diagnosis paper felt like a heartbeat she could not ignore. When the door finally opened, his face changed instantly. Shock came first, then a guarded kind of pain, like he'd been caught in something he didn't deserve. He looked thinner than she remembered, his eyes more tired, his posture tense as though holding himself upright cost effort. For a moment, neither spoke. Their silence wasn't peaceful. It was a collision of everything unsaid. He swallowed. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out steady, only because her heart refused to let fear take control. "I know," she said. Then, before he could pretend not to understand, she pulled out the diagnosis and held it up between them. The color drained from his face. His shoulders stiffened. For an instant, it looked as if the floor might give way under him. He didn't reach for the paper. He didn't invite her in. Instead, he stepped back, eyes flickering with panic, then with humiliation. "You weren't supposed to see that," he whispered, as if the truth itself had violated him. She stepped forward anyway. "I wasn't supposed to leave you either," she replied, voice breaking. "But you let me believe you didn't care. You let me walk out thinking I meant nothing to you." His jaw tightened, and his eyes turned away. The observer of destiny could see it clearly. This wasn't a man refusing love. This was a man drowning in shame. He had built his entire defense around one belief, that needing someone would make him weak, and being sick would make him unworthy. He finally moved aside, wordlessly allowing her in. The apartment looked the same in shape, but emptier in spirit. Her absence had changed the energy of every room. She placed the diagnosis on the table carefully, not like evidence, but like a truth that deserved respect. Then she faced him fully. "Why?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" He exhaled like someone collapsing inward. "Because I didn't want you to stay out of pity," he said, voice low, rough. "Because I didn't want to become your burden. Because I couldn't stand the idea of you looking at me like I was already losing." Those words hit her like a wave. She understood then what the fight had truly been about. She had mistaken his withdrawal for lack of love, but it had been love tangled with fear, love so desperate to protect her that it sacrificed honesty. The observer of destiny watched the moment her anger transformed into sorrow, because now she could see the man beneath the silence, scared, exhausted, and still trying, clumsily, to be noble. She stepped closer, eyes wet. "Do you know what hurts more than the cancer?" she whispered. "It's that you didn't trust me to love you through it." His mouth opened, then closed again. Emotion rose in his face, a battle between pride and vulnerability. "I didn't want to ruin you," he said. "You deserved someone who could give you romance, laughter, lightness, not hospital visits and fear." Her tears fell then, freely. "You don't get to decide what I deserve," she replied, voice trembling with conviction. "I deserve the truth. I deserve the chance to choose you." He looked at her, as if her words were too big to accept. "You already chose," he muttered. "You left. And I left because you let me believe I was unloved," she shot back gently, not cruelly. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I couldn't survive being invisible." That confession broke something in him. His face tightened, and he turned away, pressing a hand against his forehead, fighting the kind of emotion he had been trained to hide. Shame is a cruel companion. It tells people they're safest alone, even when they're falling apart. She reached for him. He flinched at first, then stilled when her hand rested on his arm. Her touch was familiar, but now it carried new meaning, not comfort borrowed from old habits, but commitment chosen in truth. "I'm here," she said softly, "not because I pity you, not because I'm guilty, because I love you. I always did, and I hate that you went through this alone." He finally looked at her again, eyes shining with a mixture of fear and longing. "What if it gets worse?" he asked, voice barely audible. "What if I don't? Then we face it," she interrupted. "Together. You don't get to push me away to protect me. Love doesn't work like that." Silence filled the room again, but this time it was different, thick with vulnerability, with the unbearable closeness of truth. The observer of destiny recognized this as the climax, the moment where the obstacle was finally named, confronted, stripped of disguise. Not the cancer, but the lie born from fear. He sank onto the couch like the strength had left his body. "I was ashamed," he admitted. "I felt like if you knew, you would see me differently." She sat beside him. "I do see you differently," she whispered. "I see how much you carry, how much you tried to protect me, and I see how much you need to be loved out loud." His lips trembled. For the first time since she'd known him, he let tears fall without apology. And she held him, not fixing, not forcing, just staying, proving with presence what words sometimes fail to do. That night, they talked longer than they had in months, not just about illness and fear, but about everything that had led them there. Her need to feel chosen, his inability to show tenderness when he felt powerless, the misunderstandings that grew in the dark. They made a quiet agreement: no more silence as protection, no more guessing games. He would tell her the truth, even when it terrified him. She would ask, clearly, for what she needed, without assuming he should know. When she finally left in the early hours, it wasn't with uncertainty, it was with a silent promise, renewed. She would return tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after that, until love, tested by fear and illness, proved what destiny had known all along, that romance isn't only flowers and dates. Sometimes romance is staying when life stops being easy. In the weeks after she returned to his door, love took on a new shape, one neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. Winter lingered outside, yet inside their lives something began to thaw. She didn't move back in immediately. They rebuilt with intention, like two people learning each other again under different rules. She stayed for long evenings, cooked simple meals when he was too tired, organized his medication without making it feel like a tragedy. He watched her do these things with quiet awe, still struggling to understand how she could remain without resentment. What changed first was not the illness, but the honesty. He began to speak, slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. He told her when he was scared. He admitted when he felt weak. He allowed himself to be vulnerable without turning it into distance, and she, in return, stopped pretending she didn't have feelings too. She told him when she was overwhelmed, she asked for reassurance directly. She reminded him that love wasn't proven by suffering alone, it was proven by partnership. Some days were hard. Appointments turned into long waiting rooms with fluorescent lights and quiet dread. There were mornings when nausea stole his appetite and fatigue stole his patience. There were moments when she cried alone in the bathroom because fear is still fear, even when you choose courage. But the observer of destiny saw something powerful. Neither of them ran. This time, when life became difficult, they leaned closer rather than apart. He started leaving small notes again, not grand romantic gestures, but honest ones. On the refrigerator, "Thank you for choosing me." In her purse, "I'm trying to be the man you always deserved." One night, after a difficult treatment, he reached for her hand and whispered words he had never said before without hesitation. "You are my home." She froze, tears rising instantly, because it was the kind of romance she had begged for, not flowers, but truth spoken out loud. Spring arrived gradually, and with it came tiny victories. His hair began to grow back. His energy returned in cautious waves. The doctor's updates turned from guarded to hopeful. They celebrated in quiet ways: a walk around the block, a coffee date where he held her hand across the table, laughter that didn't feel borrowed from the past but built for the future. Slowly, she realized that the man in front of her was no longer hiding. He was learning how to love in a way that could be felt. The day they finally heard the words, "in remission," it didn't feel like a loud celebration at first. It felt like silence, the holy kind. She sat beside him in the doctor's office, fingers interlaced with his, breath caught as if her body was afraid to accept relief. When the meaning settled in, She smiled through tears, and he turned to her with a look that held everything: gratitude, awe, regret, devotion. Outside the clinic, sunlight warmed the sidewalks, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a gift. He planned the gesture that would close the wound he had once created. It wasn't extravagant, it was personal. One weekend, under a bright sky, he brought her to the same park where they used to walk early in their relationship, before silence had started to separate them. A blanket lay beneath a tree, a basket waited, simple and intentional. It was a picnic, her favorite kind of date, the kind she had once hinted about and later stopped hoping for. When she saw it, she covered her mouth in disbelief. He smiled, stepping closer. "I owe you so much more than this," he said softly. "But I wanted to start with something I should have done a long time ago. I wanted you to feel chosen without having to ask." They sat together, sharing food and laughter, their shoulders touching in a way that felt both familiar and new. He spoke about the future openly now, trips they could take, mornings they could share, quiet anniversaries celebrated with intention. She listened, heart full, realizing that love hadn't just survived, it had transformed. As the afternoon softened, he reached into the basket and pulled out a small box. Her breath caught. He didn't rush the moment. He looked at her with steady eyes and said, "I hid the truth because I thought I was protecting you. But all I did was hurt you. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to live in the open with you. Every season, every joy, every hard day. If love gave me a second chance, I want to spend it proving you were always my first choice." She cried, nodding before he even finished. When he placed the ring on her finger, it didn't feel like a dramatic ending. It felt like a quiet beginning, one rooted in honesty, earned through pain, and sealed with devotion. Destiny watched them beneath that tree, knowing the greatest obstacle had never been illness alone. It had been fear, and fear had been conquered not by perfection, but by persistence. She had learned that love can exist even when romance is missing, but romance becomes inevitable when love finally learns how to speak. He had learned that protecting someone does not mean shutting them out. It means trusting them with truth. And there, in the gentle simplicity of a picnic, their story found its most beautiful proof. The secret he hid out of love no longer controlled their future. Love did. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment sharing your favorite moment. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell to receive alerts for new romantic stories. Thank you for listening, and may your own story be filled with love.